Thank you so much for watching. This is Independent Voice, and I'm Mame. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, Dr. Jill.
Thank you for having me, Mame.
Right. We're here to talk about your experience during this last visit, the recent one that you took to Ethiopia, as well as your past visits. So I'm excited to have you. I would like to first ask you to take a few minutes, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, your connection to Ethiopia.
Okay. So I'm a native Los Angelina. I am an assistant professor and part-time instructor for the University of Toledo's Africana Studies program. I teach their distance learning classes. And I'm also a 2021 Fulbright Specialist Scholar at Fort Hare University in South Africa, as well as a former Ambassador Distinguished Scholar for Ethiopia in 2018. And I'm currently an international faculty with Govan and Becky Research and Development Center at Fort Hare University in South Africa. I would say that if I was sort of encapsulate what I do, I engage in what's called citizen diplomacy or public diplomacy, and that is I use or leverage my institutional affiliations and just my own interest and commitment to African people. And I use that term African people broadly defined. And so for the past 30-something years, I've been involved in what I call democratic education. I started working in Zimbabwe at age 22, where I taught at Old Mutare, I know, Hartselle High School. I have a story about that, by the way. And I've continued that over my own professional development. I'm now a professor. And so I've continued doing that work, but now I've broadened it and it has expanded to the Horn of Africa. I will say this past trip, or I guess in October, I was a visiting Fulbright Specialist Scholar at Fort Hare University. And during that experience, my former Zimbabwean student of 32 years ago, who's now the executive dean for the University of Namibia Science and Technology, reached out to me and invited me to come and present at his university. So they actually flew me in, and I did a 2-day presentation talking about the educational exchange opportunities that both their faculty and students can participate in, as well as bringing over a US scholar. So these relationships that I've cultivated over 30 years, I want to say it's all about your personal relationships. I would not be able to do this work that I'm currently doing it if we're not for the personal relationships that I've cultivated.
That's amazing. That actually leads me straight to my next question. So what sparked that interest in Africa at such an early age?
You know, I have to attribute it to my parents. They probably didn't know this, but my parents, who are from the South and part of the civil rights generation, as you probably know, Jim Crow denied several generations of African Americans access to quality education. So my parents met in the West Coast in Los Angeles, and they made sure that all of their 3 children, I'm the youngest of 3, were going to receive the best education. And so my parents put us in the voluntary integration program. And so I was bused into all predominantly white institutions or schools, integrated the West Side schools here in Los Angeles. But even before that, my parents had books at home. We were surrounded. I grew up with Lifetime series. So I grew up, to be honest with you, looking at Africa. At that time, hominids, they were looking at sort of like the early origins of hominids. I had no idea. I'm sure my parents didn't realize what they were doing, that I was exposed to studying about Africa at such an early age. So when I became, when I went to UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, I became politicized. At that time, late 80s, the anti-apartheid struggle was going on. And I got exposed to that political struggle. And I basically said, when I graduate, with my BA, I don't care where I go, but I want to just go to Africa. And so I signed a 3-year contract with the United Methodist Church, and I was trained as a global social justice advocate. And I basically was sent to Zimbabwe, which at that time was part of the frontline states, for those of you who know Southern African history. And it is there that I cultivated and got thrown into the global arena of African world affairs. And I have been doing that work ever since. Part of the work was to come back home and to educate Americans about the need to hold our representatives accountable for our foreign policy in other parts of the world. And so I've been doing public education or foreign policy education since age 22, and just basically developed into an African area specialist because I worked in the region. And then I kept going back on my own. And then I provided opportunities for other African Americans and Africans. I took healthcare teams back to Zimbabwe and throughout the region, and basically just traveled and continued doing that over a 30-year process.
Wow, I don't even know what to say. The irony of it, though, Dr. Gio, if I could say this, I think when you were thinking about, and based on what you just said, when I grow up, so to speak, I want to go to Africa. When we were growing up in Africa, we were saying, well, when I grow up, I want to go to America. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It really is interesting. And I think now I think we have come full circle where we're saying, I want to go to Africa. Now I want to join you. Now I want to go to Africa. It's like, what possessed us to do that? But it's neither here nor there. I think life happens. It's so interesting, though. Like I said, you were growing up being exposed to the world of Africa. I'm not sure most of us had at that time, but some of us were exposed towards the Western world. And then I guess that instilled in us that following education, interest in academia. I remember most of us saying, when I grow up, I want to go to America. And I think everybody did what they can to do so. So it would be interesting to stop and ask how people feel about that now. So with that said, based on your previous experiences and in Africa in general, but particularly in Ethiopia, especially this last visit, because I think this last visit has its own essence. I think it has its own story. What was your observation? Have you had a chance to be in a forum, in a meeting, anything at all? And then what was the vibe like to actually be there? This time, when Americans were being called out, you decided to go to Ethiopia with the diaspora. What was it like to be there?
First, I want to thank the Ethiopian Diaspora Network, particularly Dr. Tadios Belay, who I consider a brother. And so when Tadios told me about this initiative, I was like, I'm going to be on the continent. And so let me know if you do decide to go, because I'll come and join you. And that's exactly what I did. And there's a couple of reasons why this is important. There's a couple of reasons why I decided to go. One, I think it's important that we support each other. I mean, physically support each other. It's one thing to sort of verbally talk about our support, but it's another thing to actually physically make a commitment, right, to support each other. And so I wanted to support Tadios because I knew it would be very emotional for him, and I wanted to be able to provide that support for him. And then I also wanted to go because as a citizen diplomat, someone who represents, whether I want to or not, the diaspora, right? People of African descent, and particularly Black Americans. I knew that it was historically important, but also important for me because I'm part of several networks, right? And my friends who are African American and just part of the diaspora and part of the larger African diaspora often look to me to basically on the ground information because I'm right there. And I wanted to make sure that I was able to, as best as possible, provide accurate information, right? Information from having been there, spoken to a variety of people in terms of getting different perspectives and being, to the best of my ability, provide that information in an accountable way. So those are my primary two reasons why I thought it was important. I would say that it was incredibly emotional. I'm still processing, to be quite honest with you, as I'm sure you know. Anytime that you go into a conflict zone, even though I lived in Southern Africa, I did live in a region that was in a conflict zone. This was somewhat different to me because I'm older and I have a deeper understanding of how conflict, war, can impact the lives of everyday people. And that's a lot of my focus, a lot of my work is on that. And so I had to prepare myself, one, to what I was going to encounter. And you can never really prepare yourself, but for the most part, prepare myself. What was I going to encounter on the ground? What was the general atmosphere going to be like? Because I am an American, that is my citizenship, my nationality. And even though I can pass, if I don't say anything, I can look like I'm from Wolo or from Southern, right, as people told me. But when I did speak, people, of course, would know that I'm an American, and particularly if I'm traveling with the Ethiopian diaspora. And so all of these dynamics were, I have to say, life-changing. I engaged the Ethiopian diaspora, by the way, there were folk from all over the world. The Ethiopian diaspora is so extensive. People speaking French, people speaking Amharic, people speaking Afar, people speaking, I mean, that's the kind of presentation that I want to bring back when I do my speaking engagements here in the US. Look, folks, we've always been cosmopolitan. To want to come to the US, as you said earlier, I think that's natural. We're cosmopolitan people, like any other group of people. But was more important though were the personal relationships that were developed over this trip. So I was one of two African Americans or Black Americans who came at the invitation of Tadios. I came with Dr. Lee. And I would say that having worked in Ethiopia, the general atmosphere, of course, was, at least for us on the bus, I mean, I think people were deeply, this was a reunion for many people coming back over 20 something, 30 years, right? And so seeing their family, friends, what's going on in the continent, I think it was deeply emotional for Ethiopians, which I of course can't speak for, but I could just be a witness in terms of what I observed. In terms of people making commitments, people made commitments on the ground, as I did, in terms of when we came back or went back to our respective places that we live, how we were going to participate in the reconstruction efforts. We were received by the Afar and the Amhara regional governments. I can speak more to my Afar experience because I left when I got to Kambolcha. The Afar president, the president of the Afar region, greeted us, as well as the ministers. I mean, like personally greeted us when Tadios let them know that there were visited Black Americans who came. And I had an opportunity to share that my previous work in Africa and how I've leveraged my institutional affiliations to provide support for both African students, as particularly Ethiopian students that are here in the US, as well as those that I support presently in Ethiopia. But that I would come back home and specifically speak to the National Organization of Minority Architects and the National Minority Association, or the National Medical Association, both organizations of which I have personal relationships with people. My professional background is I have a PhD in public administration, but I'm an interdisciplinary scholar who's worked across so many disciplines and professional areas that I have these deep networks, and that I would have conversations with them to see to what extent they'd be interested in wanting to participate in the reconstruction efforts. As you know, the critical infrastructure was targeted in all of the regions where there's conflict going on. So the clinics and the hospitals, which I had seen, to be quite honest with you, done in Southern Africa, right? Take out the critical infrastructure, which of course, you know, has a drastic impact on the healthcare status of particularly of women and children, right? And the infirmed and the elderly, right? And to also speak to the National Medical Association, because I know that I've been following the thread, the Twitter thread of the Ethiopian healthcare professionals that are working in the Tigray region. And so a lot of my information about like what are the direct healthcare or access to healthcare concerns I'm getting from that sort of network. So these are the two areas that I said that I would pledge and mobilize people. And I'm in that process of doing that right now. A couple of the other areas that I felt that were where I could perhaps provide support at the behest of the regional governments would be when we visited the internal displaced persons settlements that the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, they provided those plastic tarps, but fundamentally the housing stock that the Afar people, of course, are using from their own materials, I felt like that there needed to be perhaps more conversation or thought about the need to develop what I call temporary housing, more temporary and sustainable housing, and addressing the needs of safe cleaning or potable water and sanitation. That's what I immediately saw. And having conversations with Ethiopian colleagues, once again, about to what extent would there be an interest in receiving support from Black professional associations in this, and at the behest of their call and working with them in doing this. Those are the priority areas for me in the work that I'm doing. Some of the other important conversations that I had with at least the group of Ethiopians that I had on the bus had to do with and it's a very sensitive area. So the U.S. government's foreign policy towards the Horn of Africa, and particularly Ethiopia. Some people, at least I've shared with a few people, that I'm part of the constituency for Melvin Foot's organization. It just slipped my mind, but we've been holding high-level meetings with the Biden administration Africa administrators. We just met last week with Director Banks. She's the director for African Affairs for the NSC. So we met with Assistant Secretary, Undersecretary Ms. Fee, Ms. Banks, and I'm sitting in the room and having these conversations at this high level. And I'm publicly letting people know I have this level of access, because if there are questions that you want me specifically to ask, right, give me those questions and I will put those questions with CFAs. What we've done is that we've compiled our questions across several foreign policy areas that they will answer. This is the kind of high level engagement that Ethiopian diaspora here, at least in the US, need to have. I mean, in terms of trying to understand how US foreign policy actually works. What are the access points, right? To the extent that the congressional avenue is closed off, because I believe what's going on, just from my own understanding, is that this is has been defined as a national security issue. Therefore, the policy is being made directly from the executive branch, not the congressional branch. It's above their pay grade, if you understand what I'm saying. So you need to have access at that level. One of the other ways that I advise to groups that potentially you could have access is to the African Diplomatic Corps. If you cannot, as an advocacy group, gain that level of access, if you have access with or relationships, and if you don't, you want to develop it with the African Diplomatic Corps, they themselves, that entity, right, institutional entity, does have that executive level access. So then you use the African Diplomatic Corps as your voice. This is the type of sort of advising that I've been giving groups to try to help them understand how to facilitate this kind of engagement. Of course, there's protest, always there's protest, but that goes so far, right? So let me speak a little bit more about something that was very sensitive. It's an issue that I spoke to some Ethiopian diaspora about who are here, who live in the US, right? And that is this issue around Karen Bass. To what extent are the Black, right, congressional Black representatives, right, representing the interests of Ethiopians and those who also support Ethiopia and Africa policy? And I tried to explain that it's above Karen Bass, as well as Representative Karen Bass, as well as Representative Barbara Lee's pay grade, if this is a national security issue. So some of the vitriolic, I'll say vitriolic behavior or attacks towards those individuals, I would say this. Folks, this is a cross-cutting issue for Black Americans, right? Understand that Black Americans look at Barbara Lee, Representative Barbara Lee, and Representative Karen Bass, right, as part of our community that's spearheading interests that have to do with Africa interests, but also Black American interests. Mm-hmm. So if you decide to take that route, understand that you're going to also then come in direct conflict with African Americans, which we don't want. This is a very sensitive issue. It's called a cross-cutting issue, political issue. So how do we understand the interconnection between domestic and foreign policy, which is an area that I've been working in for 30-something years? And how do we understand the larger sort of environment that these two interest groups have and work together, right? So I started doing a matrix, and perhaps when we have a panel, I can talk a little bit more about this matrix I started developing. I started developing a matrix that identified the Ethiopian diaspora within the US and the African American constituency quality of life areas. What are the areas that we have that impact us, right? That we can work together on, right? In terms of having representatives that represent our interests, and recognize that there are class differences, right? We have to, let's be real about, there are class differences both within the Black community, Black American and Ethiopian diaspora. But these quality of life areas, where there are areas of overlap, we can work on strategically, right? But then where there are areas of divergent, immigration issues, right? foreign policy issues if we're talking about the Horn of Africa, specifically Ethiopia. Many African Americans may not even be aware of that. So there's a need for public education on both sides. But how do we structure that public education, right, piece? So I'm interested in working with people who have this understanding so that we don't end up fighting each other.
Yes.
Right? I don't want us to fight each other because then we both lose. Absolutely. Right?
I think you touched a very, very critical and crucial point, Dr. Jill. You said quite a bit. I am all questions now, but I'm gonna sort of back into it because I think you have said so many incredible points that we need to address because it's important in my mind. I would like to begin with because it is very sensitive a matter, and what you had said, we do not want to fight against, one another, the diaspora versus the African Americans. There is a whole lot of education, I think, to be done in that sense. There's been questions among the Ethiopian community here or the diaspora in terms of people that have certain access helping the cause here. And since you had mentioned Representative Karen Pass, she has sponsored at least 2 resolutions. That doesn't necessarily have the bigger picture. It's not necessarily saying nay or yay or asking her to turn her interest completely to what it is we're asking her. I think the question was, people wanted her to have a balanced outlook as to what was really happening and how these resolutions were being developed and who was feeding that information. I think some of the feelings came from that. It just felt like it was falling on deaf ears. I bet it's probably the most difficult place for her to be. I understand that. And that's why we're not in politics. At least I'm not. But I think it's stemming from that. And I know you've touched a huge content of that, which is public education for people to understand what it means. All of us, most of us, jumped right into this fire because we cared, because we don't want Ethiopia to be dismantled. And that's how come we all jumped in. It doesn't mean we fully understand and grasp what it means to be in a position like hers. So I would really like for you to maybe speak about how can we go about educating our community in terms of what it means to be in a place like that. What are they charged with to do? And how helpful could it be in educating our own community? Because midterm is coming, people are talking about it. My fear is this is going to divide us. My fear is this is going to become another battle. And the last thing I want to see is even the diaspora amongst itself getting into some kind of conundrum and going, So if we didn't understand fully, then we could miss an opportunity, and it could come across like we're fighting against each other. How can we go about educating the diaspora community about bringing this change that we see and how we work with these elected officials? And then I will go back up to some of the things you said earlier and ask you a couple of questions.
Sure. So you want to identify groups, because I know that there are groups and there are people who can provide just like an overview of how U.S. foreign policy operates. What are the major institutions? So there's the formal institutions, and then there's the informal, right? Mm-hmm. I kind of identified both and how they work, right? So you want to be able to have access to people, and there are right here in our community. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years, right? But there are other people, higher level, other folk, there's grassroots folk who do have a very good understanding of how our foreign policy operates, but also its relationship to domestic. We don't ever want to, let me rephrase it in a positive way. We want to understand that there's a relationship between the domestic and foreign policy. There is, right? And so part of it is just consciousness raising, right? So I know the Ethiopian Diaspora Network has people. Dr. Tadios is one. Myself, I'm sure that there are grassroots organizations. Recognize that there needs to be some understanding about whoever these folk are, groups are, some understanding about what your objectives are, because understand that people have different politics, right? And so if there can be some agreement upon what is it that we fundamentally want to do, points 1, 2, and 3, right? And then identify folk who are willing to do that and begin that process of public education. It was like very much like the anti-apartheid movement. or any of these other sort of quote unquote foreign policy issues, right? Identify those folk who make the commitment, maybe identify some curriculum, right, to assist people, and then have those conversations. You've got to allow spaces for people to have the conversations, right? Faith-based institutions.
Absolutely.
So there's all these different civic associations or faith-based institutions that can participate in this process. The other thing is you do want to cultivate relationships with people who do sit in these high-level spaces. I've been sitting in rooms with African diaspora folk, right? Folk from the continent, right? Across every policy area you can think of, across different African countries and the Caribbean, like the entire diaspora is there. There's a wonderful network that people could tap into. So participating in the constituency for Africa, right, gives you a vehicle then to actually sit in these rooms, virtual rooms, when we're actually meeting these high-level executive branch,
exactly,
right, to gain an understanding, right? There are people that I've met within the Ethiopian diaspora itself that sit in these high-level institutions. They don't necessarily want to be visible, and that's okay, folks. That's just part of the game, but you still want to have access to them so you can get insider information, right? It's something that I learned doing this for 30 years, folks. Look, I'm an activist at heart. I am, but I've learned from my professional and academic training how to move into these spaces, right? And be Dr. Humphries. The same way I know how to move into activist spaces and to be the activist, Jill. You need to be fluid like that to have access to information for our communities. For 30 years, I've been talking about Black Americans, because I'm a Black American, about our need to have a better understanding about foreign policy at the grassroots level. And I've expanded that to include, of course, the diaspora. I can't speak for Representative Bass, but what I will say, or Representative Barbara Lee, but what I will say in terms of my knowledge of them, and particularly Representative Barbara Lee, who was the only representative who voted against the Iraq war. Please understand what that means. No one else from the Senate to the House of Representatives had the courage to do that, right? So understand what that means. I mean, I'm sure there's parallels in the context of Ethiopian politics when you find people who have integrity like that, right? So part of it is to be able to have these conversations with these individuals off the record. I just had a conversation with the first, it's okay, he wouldn't mind. I just had a conversation with General William Ward. He was the first general appointed to AFRICOM. And I specifically wanted to speak to him because I needed to have a better understanding of the role of the Department of Defense in issues of not just military and security in the Horn, but in governance. Right? Because my interest is, or where I'm situated, is on the governance and humanitarian side. Right? So folks, for those of us who understand that you've got to have this access, you want to be able to have these kind of conversations and take that information to then assist us, right, at different levels to do this other hard level work. Everyone's not going to agree, and that's okay. But what I will say is that, at least for me, I operate from a principle of integrity.
There you go.
And so that's something that we as a community need to talk about, is integrity and ethical behavior, decision-making. That's what governs sort of my work, right? In the way in which I move throughout these spaces. In terms of moving forward, I've been reading and staying up to breast on what folk on the left are saying. But folk, that's a very small community. There are different with the publics. There's a core, right? Leftist folk, right? And then you have concentric circles. We want to start penetrating those other circles.
100% agreed. I couldn't agree better with you. I think that's exactly where we're at, Dr. Jill. This conversation is so timely. Like I said, midterm is coming. We're looking at it. And before we know it, it would be upon us. And because of what is going on right now, and it's not even today's conversation, but because we're talking about it with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, we have quite a bit to talk about and also learn how the world is reacting to seemingly about the same situation. But, when it comes to Africa, the whole outlook is different. And what I really, really liked, what you just said, to me, it's, I think, critical, is there is the core, the nucleus, and then there is the outer layer. And you have to know how to kind of penetrate the outer layer. If you can't massage that outer layer, you can't get to the core, because the core is looking at to the layers, and whatever energy they're getting from the outer layer is what gets them going and how they activate what they do in the decisions. So I think I will take you up on that, Dr. Jill. We do have several groups that I know. Ethiopian Public Diplomacy Network is one. I would love to invite you to these forums so that maybe people like you and others can come and educate us. Because, like I said, out of a need, we all jump right in head first. Now we're in it. We have to learn how to swim. You have to learn how to be that fluid, that flexibility, and with an understanding. So I'm so glad you'd mentioned that. I'm gonna take you back to a couple of things that you had mentioned. We're gonna go back to Africa for a minute, and maybe we will return here. You talked about few major things that really made an impact on you since, this last visit. And you talked about commitment. And, I'll say this, listening to you and hearing you say we, first of all, makes me feel like, wow, that's the kind of thing we need, the we, us together. Okay. You're not necessarily talking to me as somebody who is a foreign to Africa. You're putting yourself in the whole situation, and you're saying we, including when you're talking about the commitment. You've made some commitments. You came here, you're looking for ways to find that commitment. You talked about that support, being there for one another, because the emotional turmoil, I think, is the greatest, and that's going to be the longest. And maybe if you can take a minute and talk about what sorts of commitment would you say the diaspora should get engaged in, and not just the diaspora, anyone who happens to be a human being that cares about what happens to people. As you may notice, like I said, the comparison is just completely different. When something happens elsewhere, the world reacts in such a different way, versus when something happens in Africa, the world kind of like, yeah, them Africans are, you know what I mean? So how can we get the outer layer? We talked about the American citizens, human beings, because that's the common thing that we have. We all are humans. Get them to commit to something as much as they would like to commit elsewhere. What would you say? I mean, what would be a message?
I will say this is what I learned from my work in Southern Africa at an early age. People, because I developed my storytelling through images. I'm a photographer and I'm a videographer. Matter of fact, I'll show very quickly just a few of my slides for you. I'm a photographer and I'm a videographer. So when I came back 30 something years ago and started doing this work, I learned very quickly that I could capture people through my images, or my images capture people. Now there's an ethical aspect to that we have to be very careful of, such as I have not shown any of my photos that I've taken in the Afar region of the internally displaced person camps. But at the same time, images are very important. They tell a powerful story. Same thing with interviewing people. I interviewed people on the ground, right? Who could tell their story. Get young folk, period, regardless of ethnicity, nationality. Get young folk who understand the power of media, right? And who are very passionate. And they can help craft these narratives. Whomever decides, however you all, let's say your organization decides to craft whatever that narrative is, that's the narrative that you want to try to get people to touch their hearts. All I can say, folks, it really is about touching their hearts. That's been most of the work that I have comes out of my heart. I know that's not something that we don't like to talk about as professionals, but the work that I do is really heart driven. I'm just going to say that from the beginning. But you've got to touch people's hearts. Right. And Ukrainian story clearly touches people's hearts in terms of a civilian population or a country being attacked. It's the same thing when I think about this when people think about Africa and so-called conflicts, right? Africa in many ways, or African people, and I tell people all the time, we're no different than anybody else in terms of we've had high civilizations. We've had monarchies, we've had clan-based societies, we've had complex cosmopolitans, we've had inner conflicts, right? We're human, right? We are not something out there in outer space. So how do we humanize? How do we get the world to understand? And I understand we're fighting against issues of white supremacy. Believe me, I understand that. Those narratives and very powerful ideological norms, but those are also being crushed. Right? The institutions that facilitate that ideology. My parents exposed me to Africa, not my educational institutions at all. I want people to understand this. My parents from the South exposed me to Africa, whether they realized it or not my K through 12 or my higher education, undergrad to doctorate, right? So that responsibility primarily rests on our shoulders as people of African and African descent, but it also rests on the shoulders of these other groups of people, institutions, right, that are part of the world. They have an obligation too. That's what I heard you say. Let's use these words. What is their obligation to Africa? What is the US's obligation to Africa to have a fair, just, and equitable foreign policy that focuses on human development, not militarization? Granted, there are issues. Yes, there are issues that we do have to fundamentally address, but they're connected to quality of life issues, right? To the extent we see the rise of some of the, what they call extremist or jihadist groups being able to take control of the Sahel, if the governments were able to provide, right, quality of life, meet the issues of health, education, social services, safe communities, those entities, right, or formation of the entities would have less leverage, right? So I'm very passionate about this. I mean,
yeah, it's not just even what's their obligation, what is the interest of?
Right. What is their interest? That's the first thing I've actually advised my Ethiopian colleagues who've asked me. I said, you know what? I've sat in some of the meetings and I understand it's very emotional, but you all never asked the question. The question you should be asking me is, what's the interest? What is the national interest? And then from there, once you get to understand, then, right? So I'm a US citizen. I'm going to claim that. People have different political views about Black Americans, saying that, whether or not we should claim our US citizen. I'm a US citizen. I have nowhere else to go. I would love for African country, Ethiopia, to grant me dual citizenship. Liberia that's another conversation I've had. Liberia, or actually Ghana, and I think Liberia is on the verge. Yeah. I would love for Ethiopia to grant Black Americans dual citizenship. But to the extent that I am a US citizen, I want my representatives to tell me what is the national interest that is governing the policy for the Horn of Africa, and specifically Ethiopia.
Yes.
What is it explicitly?
And you know what? I think in the recent years since the conflict, we have had some opportunity to ask that specific question, but you never get an answer. We just don't think the current administration really cares about the American interest, is what at least I heard in my own ears. This is not even hearsay. But I think you touched on it earlier. We have to be at the right place. We have to be at the right table to have that kind of conversation where the right people are in attendance to tell you, here is the American interest, not just obligation. I think interest comes and then the obligation, because the obligation comes when you're interested in something, correct? So I think you're right. The question should be, what is the national interest?
Yeah. Keep asking and also write about it. Awesome. So I wrote a piece when Ambassador Susan Rice was being looked at to be the Secretary of State. And there was, of course, what I call the vitriolic race baiting and gender baiting coming from the Republican. And then there was, of course, a visceral response from African Americans wanting to defend her. And I and Bill Fletcher, for those of you who may know him, I said, Bill, I really want to write a piece talking about the way in which race and gender are used on both sides to make the argument to either not support her or to support her, when we really should be asking, what are her policies towards, in my particular interest, Africa.
Africa.
And that's the basis in which I'm going to critique her. And that's the article that I wrote,
Awesome.
right? That look at her policies. Her policies as a hawk, her policies as a hawk were detrimental to Africa. And as a result, no, I do not necessarily want her to be the next Secretary of State, right?
Yeah.
Based upon her policies.
Yes.
So when I once again, when I'm talking to my African colleagues, or just those of us in the diaspora, not just Africa, but those of us in the, look, understand what the game is.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, critique the race and gender race baiting, but fundamentally, she, as others, right, are simply doing what the white elite, because we're talking about the elite. These are elites. Yeah. That's the other thing, folks. Yeah. Foreign policy making is an elite making space.
Yes.
Understand this, right? So we're talking about the elites, right? Primarily white elites, in the way in which they've brought in some people of color to advance the interests of elites, which are not the interests of the larger masses of people. So that's sort of, for those of you, that's my sort of political positioning.
Yeah,
right.
And I think you're giving us an amazing education right here in saying, get to know their policies. It's not what party they belong to or what they say. Technically, go look at their policies, where they stand. And that should be the very first thing we look at. And that should be what matters before we look at anything else. Because, well, if their policy stands as elsewhere, what good is it for me if they belong to this party or that party?
It's bipartisan. Another major point I brought to folk is, please understand this when I say this. I'm not rallying on behalf of the Democratic Party, but please understand that if it's a national interest, it means it's bipartisan. It doesn't matter if it's Democrats or Republicans, it supersedes that. And in the case of the Horn, what's going on, I'm telling you, it's bipartisan. If anything, understand it's a national security issue, and as a result, it's bipartisan. Please understand who the Neo-Confederacy are, right? The Neo-Confederates have no interest in Africans. The Neo-Confederates, right, are the political group, right, were the plantocracy owners of slavery. There needs to be a lot more education.
Right.
A lot more education.
Yes. I think it goes to reaction versus proaction. When you're in front of a fire, the thing you're going to do is react. It's a knee-jerk action. If something is burning, I'm going to react. What we've been wanting and saying is that how do we get over the hump where we continue to be reactive versus proactive? It gets again to what you talked about earlier, the public education. It's very critical. It's very important, especially where we're at today. And as we're speaking of this, I'm thinking about what's coming in a few months. I really, sometimes it gives me a little bit of a concern how this is going to drive out, because within the community, within the Ethiopian diaspora, within the African-American community, there is a different school of thought. And I worry that we're not prepared. We're going to be reactive and not necessarily proactive. We have been and will continue to speak about the need to educate ourselves and educate the public. When I say this, it's two-pronged. Educate our own community and also educate Americans about Africa. I'm going to take you back to Ethiopia one more time because it's leading us to an interesting and very critical and important point. You talked about the rebuilding. And while you had mentioned the rebuilding process, that's where you talked about commitment from people and the infrastructure, the schools that have been destroyed, the hospitals and or the different infrastructures that have been impacted. As you were talking about that, you also had mentioned the public administration. The system also needs to rebuild. And that's what sparked an interest in me. As much as we need to rebuild the hospitals and the schools, I really truly believe the public administration, the system itself needs an overhaul. Big time restructure, big time rebuild. What do you think about that?
Okay, you're gonna get me in trouble, huh?
You and I both together. We're going to get in trouble.
We're going to get in trouble.
We're going to get in trouble together.
I was a visiting scholar in 2018. I taught at Harvard University, and I was attached to the College of Business and Economics. And I taught master's level students as well as doctorate management students. You know, yes, your country, right? There are conversations I think that are already going on by people within the field of public administration who understand the need to redesign the administrative structures, right? Coupled with the political structures. You have to do both.
Of course.
Right? You have to do both. Within your policy agenda, there are so many areas that need, right, redesigning or conceptualizing and thinking about where you want your country to be, right? And that is the sole purview of the Ethiopian people, broadly defined. So I agree with that, and I believe that there are attempts to address the administrative side, but it's going to take time. It took time to build the system that you have, the administrative structures, right, and systems that you have. I was experiencing like 3 or 4 different norms and administrative systems, so much so that when I wrote my report, my final report that I gave to about my experience was that ultimately this direction has to come from the Ethiopian people, right? In terms of, I've asked people, well, what are the Ethiopian norms and values that influence your institutions, right? Like I can talk to you about US norms and values that influence the development of our democratic systems, but I'm still trying to understand and you know, for Ethiopians who are doing this type of work, right? Well, what are the Ethiopian norms and values that fundamentally want to shape your institutions? That's normally how it flows, your norms and values, and then, right, the institutional design. Well, what is that? What does that look like? I know that when I was there just this past January, I looked at the local paper and it said that your Ministry of Education just redesigned, I think it's I believe it's the higher education, just went through this whole strategic development and redesigning of your curriculum because they recognized that they had this sort of schizophrenic, piece and
archaic system.
Process. Right. I'll let you say that.
I'll be the first to say it is archaic. It's been there forever. It hasn't come to the 20th century. And it was about time for them to do that. And you know what? Education is the key. Yes, the education system, the younger generation, the kids that are being brought up needs to be brought up with a different mindset altogether. And I've been talking about the changing of the mindset for the longest time. And I think I'll do that until I can't anymore, because that's what we need. We do need to do a conscious change when it comes to the mindset, right? It has to be deliberate. It has to be intentful. But for the upcoming generation, the education system has such a power to influence that. And if they continue to do the same thing since, I don't know, we were kids, then they're not doing them justice. They're not doing them any service. So I'm glad to hear that the education system is changing. I'll say this to you, and maybe you can elaborate on it. Mm-hmm. I understand even for us here in the States, we talk about public administration. We're still learning. Public administration changes. Public administration is impacted by politics. Public administration is impacted by economy. Public administration is impacted by so many different factors. And when I think about public administration in Ethiopia, is it the same way as we know it here or elsewhere, or Africa has its own game over there? Do you know? Kind of. Do you have a sense of that?
So yes, there are fundamental, quote unquote, fundamental principles of public administration. There's the classics, right? But of course, Ethiopia has its own public administration because it has a different political system and history. Remember, culture and values and norms influence our administrative process. Our administration, right? So, and I'm going to say this, and this probably will get me in trouble, but Ethiopian women, I'm going to say this, are key. I'm just going to say this. I was the only woman with a PhD in the college, and I was not Ethiopian. Our lived experiences, your lived experiences as an Ethiopian woman, my lived experience as an African-American woman here in the US, shape the way in which we think about politics and administration differently than our male counterparts. What we focus on. It tends to be women who also tend to focus more on the impact of the war on human beings' lives. Like, that's a very big area of mine, even though I talked about the critical infrastructure, but I immediately linked it to it impacted the women and children and elderly and seniors, right? Who use these services, who need these services. Ethiopia has, I don't know if you followed it, but the last thing I read was that over a 12 to 20 year period, Ethiopia has made tremendous gains in reducing maternal and child mortality rates. Yes. I have a master's in public health focused on women and children, right? That is phenomenal, given the economic, right, what was going, it's phenomenal.
Absolutely.
So when I say this, by educating girls and women, having them in key decision-making places, and I don't mean symbolically, I mean where they actually have power to make decisions and to help influence and shift the way men, boys and men, think about themselves in their relationship, right, to girls and women. So public administration is key around that. It's key.
It is. And I think empowering women to step into roles as such, I think is critical, especially, and this one is going to get me in trouble, but I'll say it anyways. A lot of our community is engaged in, you may know this, in the medical field. I'm not saying that's such a bad thing. For the longest time, so many years ago, when I held a different position, I actually made it a point to try and convince our Ethiopian ladies to study something other than a pharmacist or a nurse or something else, because we have enough of those, but we don't have women or men psychiatrists, psychologists into the social world. Our social issues are going to catch up with us. And that's how come we've been trying to advocate and encourage community members to consider different things. Now we're saying, don't be afraid of stepping into politics, but it isn't necessarily politics. I think lately we all have been pushed into politics. I don't have a single bone in me that is political, but guess what? When the need came, we all are trying. We stepped into a foreign world to us. I think Ethiopia is at that verge right now where not just administration, not just the political situation. I think the system also is needing a facelift, some kind of restructuring. And I think it may be empowering and educating women is going to be interesting. And just listening to you makes me want to be done with this whole thing and go do something. I know we all are trying to do the best that we can. So before we end this conversation, though, Dr. Jill, I have to ask you, the image behind you is unbelievable. Look at that.
Let me move out the way so you can actually see.
The woman standing next to you was carrying that.
Yes.
And you tried to carry it. Were you successful?
Down in Toto.
Were you successful? Were you able to? No,
I couldn't lift it. I could not lift. And she laughed. They snickered. The women wood carrying bearers snickered at me, because I couldn't even lift it. And I'm a fairly athletic person. And every time I've seen the women coming down, by the way, this is in Toto Mountains, I've been amazed. And I'm going to say this. First of all, they're wearing like flat shoes. They're not even wearing like cushion tennis shoes. They're flip-flops. You see their clothing. So it's not like they have anything to protect their bodies from the actual pressure of this heavy burden. Right. And they're moving fast. And so, every time I see them, of course, it's a phenomenal sight. But I also just wonder the strain, right? How much do they get? How much do they? I think it was a co-op. So how much revenue they even generate for doing this backbreaking work, right? What are the kind of, in the event that they do have any kind of injuries, what kind of care would they be able to receive? And it's just to see women. I know some people will say, women can do anything, but it doesn't mean we have to do it.
And now,
like in my mind, I'm like, it doesn't mean, African-American women or those of us who were my ancestors who were enslaved were in back-breaking work for 7 days a week, multiple hours, doesn't mean that they should be doing it. Mm-hmm. Right. So when I went back this last time, I expected to see them. But as you may already know, in Toto, I have to say that the development in Addis is phenomenal. The architectures who've done this, it's turned into a whole park now, a theme park. And the women now have moved into, I think it's so it's a co-op now, so they no longer do that backbreaking work as another way for them to generate income. But may I show you the few slides?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, there's Dr. Tadios.
Yes. We had a wonderful Afar Regional Special Forces.
This is the Afar region?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's some fierce look.
The government received us. This is one of your ambassadors.
Okay. Awesome. Wow. Nice.
Those are just a few. I have hundreds of photos, but I just wanted to share those few photos with you. Via Afar.
And I'm glad you did that. I'm so glad you did that. You went all the way to Afar because, the media is the media. I'm not even going to get into that, but people like you who have gone there and heard it, touched it, ate with the people, talked with the people. If anything else, your gut feeling, you would know. So I'm glad you're sharing this. So one last question before we wrap up.
Yes.
If you were to say in 3 words about Ethiopia currently and Ethiopia in the near future, what would you say?
Deep healing. Deep healing. Not just because of the present, but successive decades. Deep healing, bright future. Young people, you have such a bright future because your young people are phenomenal. Having had an opportunity to teach, work with them, and still supporting them. You have such a bright future because of your young people.
You know what? Those are powerful. Healing is what is needed to happen. It's not just the last 1 year. It's been decades.
It's been decades, and that's what I realized working there.
Yeah. And you said it. Deep healing is what is needed. And we all need to work towards that as we're rebuilding the infrastructure. We need to rebuild the system and we need to rebuild the mindset. We need to rebuild and heal from decades of atrocities. And for the young generation, and I'll add one more thing because we talked about it, the young generation as well as women need to really realize that they have space in this game. They have space in this bright future. And I am so glad we have had this conversation. I'm encouraged. You just have to promise me next time you go, you'd have to take me. And on behalf of them as well as all of us here, Dr. Jill, I just want to say heartfelt thank you. You referring to this whole experience as we means a lot to us. It means friendship, it means support, it means connection, it means understanding in this world when you have to fight for the entire continent of Africa and the world seems to be looking the other way. And you connecting to Africa and here connecting us to the African American community means a lot to us. So I'm really grateful and I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you so much for watching. This is Independent Voice and I'm Mame.